I am Ethan Miller, 42 years old, and I've spent half my life between workbenches, spreadsheets, and prototypes that wake up before the sun. When the city is still dozing, ideas shout loudly and demand space, and I listen to them like someone tuning into a fine engine. My reputation was born from impossible deadlines, met with precision, but without sacrificing the ethics that guide every project. I've always believed that work should be honest, even when the pressure for results tries to bend the metal of character. And that's why my greatest pride was never the position, but the signature I left on every invention. In the executive corridors, they called me the watchmaker, because I understood the whole machine, not just a single screw. Every patent was a gear I fitted with patience, anticipating the friction, the torque, and the wear of the real world. I knew where the system could fail and how to shield it, and that knowledge gave me a cold tranquility. But it also bothered those who saw innovation as a showcase rather than the foundation of the business. Perfectionism has a cost when the quarter calls more shots than the long-term vision. I never learned to flatter. I prefer the frankness that pinches but doesn't break, because it reveals what needs to be seen. There was a tacit agreement. I delivered results, and they let me build without interference from vanity. That balance crumbled the instant a political request crossed my desk with the smell of shortcut. I read it 3 times, trying to find some technical sense, and found only haste and surnames. There I understood that integrity would be tested with velvet gloves. The CEO, Richard Stone, demanded that I train his daughter, Clara, to skip steps and land in a strategic position. It wasn't about training, but about endorsement, as if competence could be transferred by osmosis. Shortcuts like that open craters in the culture, and I've seen companies plummet over those edges. I took a deep breath, weighed the cost of the response, and chose the only one I could sustain. I said no, with the calm of someone who knows the price would come with interest. The sound of that no ricocheted off the glass walls and hit Richard's smile, polished like a blade. He summoned the board to align expectations, and I understood it would be a trial with an audience. I underestimated, however, the hunger for control that lurks in rooms that confuse power with merit. I had the technical truth, but they had the spectacle in the chairs. Still, I accepted the summons like someone accepting an inevitable test. That night I revisited my patents like someone reviewing scars that tell their own story. 38 records with my sweat, each sustaining a vital slice of the business. They weren't trophies, they were foundations, and I knew exactly where the pillars plunged into the ground. I realized with surprise that I had a weapon I never wanted to wield, and that perhaps it was time to use it to remind everyone where the true value lay. The meeting room looked like an expensive aquarium, with a view of Manhattan and mirrors that multiplied vanities. The directors twirled pens like elegant daggers, and Clara sat beside her father, impeccable, distant. I had nothing personal against her, just against the ornamental leap over steps that demand sweat. When a shortcut disguises itself as strategy, engineering becomes makeup to cover cracks. I entered prepared to say what no one wanted to hear. Richard opened with textbook terms: succession, synergy, vision, smooth words that slip through any analysis. Then came the practical translation. I should transfer my know-how in record time to legitimize the appointment. I explained that knowledge isn't the file, leadership isn't a diploma, and maturity doesn't fit in a political schedule. I reminded them that robust systems are born from error, frustration, and listening, not from surnames engraved in steel. I concluded that I wouldn't give my name to seal a theater of competence. His response was a short, crystalline, hard laugh, and then the accusation of insubordination landed on the table. The firing was public, choreographed to educate those watching in silence behind their glasses. Someone closed my notebook with a small, definitive gesture, like turning off a light at a funeral. I felt anger, but also a rough freedom, the kind of someone who no longer needs to negotiate the non-negotiable. I left the building carrying with me what truly belonged to me: authorship. Outside, the cutting wind delivered the truth I pretended not to see. I still had the essentials: 38 signed patents, each with paths, dependencies, and keys that I knew with my eyes closed. I could pull a thread and watch the entire rug move, slowly or all at once, according to the calculation. It wasn't blackmail, it was consequence, the moral physics of what is built without respect. There not greed was born, but the need for correction. I called Michael Harris, lawyer and friend who listens to the law like I listen to machines. I described the scenario, pointed out risks, heard his silence measure the size of the earthquake. "If you do it, there's no turning back," he said, and I replied that certain bridges had been burned by others, not by me. I didn't want to sell anything to anyone. I wanted to repair a distortion created by arrogance. When I hung up, I realized that the first move had already been executed inside me. In the early hours of that morning, I opened my lab notebook and redesigned the map of what sustains that empire. I identified interdependencies, bottlenecks, key patents, and damage propagation times to avoid collateral collapses. I wouldn't destroy for the sake of destruction. I would calibrate the consequence to hit exactly the error that originated it. The plan took shape with the serenity of a diagnosis that doesn't seek revenge, just points to the cause. And when the day broke, I already knew where I would start pulling the thread. The meeting began with everyone settled around that glass table that looked more like an altar of vanities. Richard took the floor, describing my refusal as an act of rebellion against the company's hierarchy. I realized I wasn't there to talk, but to be displayed as an example. Clara watched in silence, with a discreet smile that irritated me more than any words. I knew the sentence had already been written before the first phrase. He called me insubordinate in front of everyone, as if my value were reduced to a stain on his authority. Reactions varied between looks of pity and silent complicity, but no one dared raise their voice in my favor. The word firing fell like a stone in a lake, spreading rapid waves through the room. The impact wasn't in the fact itself, but in the carefully staged spectacle of humiliation. I felt the weight of that strategy, designed to break me. As I gathered my few belongings, I realized that real power wasn't at that table. What Richard didn't know was that there were still invisible strings connecting my name to the company's structure. Every registered patent was a brick sustaining the empire he believed he owned. I left the building with a strange mix of anger and freedom, like someone losing the prison and winning the war in silence. And in that instant, my revenge began to breathe. On the way home, Manhattan's streets reflected lights that seemed to mock my failure. But behind the public defeat, a plan was taking shape in my mind with the precision of a tuned engine. I still didn't know how far I would go, but I already felt the force of an irrevocable decision. The patents were mine, and they could be used as sword or shield. The company's future was directly tied to my next step. That night, I sat in front of the computer and reviewed each record like a general reviewing his arsenal. It was an entire legacy that suddenly could be transformed into calculated ruin. For the first time, I saw my creations not as fruits of pride, but as ammunition for settling scores. And the more I read, the more the idea gained body and inevitability. It was as if every technical line were also a silent cry of revenge. If you followed my story this far, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters of this corporate revenge. I knew I was about to cross a point of no return. It wasn't just about me, but about everyone who had been silenced by a system of arrogance and hubris. Maybe I was just the spark of something bigger, and that gave me even more certainty. As I turned off the apartment lights, I already had the conviction that the first blow would be inevitable. The countdown had begun. The first days after the firing were wrapped in an almost deafening silence. The routine that once was filled with meetings and deadlines now seemed like an empty abyss. I woke up early out of habit, but without the urgency to don the armor of the chief engineer. The small apartment became both refuge and prison, where anger echoed off every wall. But it was in that silence that revenge found fertile ground. I reviewed my life like someone disassembling a mechanism to understand where the gear failed. I recalled years of dedication, sleepless nights, moments when I chose the company over family. And I realized that in the end, it had all been traded for one word: insubordination. That injustice couldn't be left in peace because it wasn't just personal. It was a warning that everyone was disposable in the face of one man's vanity. I talked with Michael, my lawyer friend, who listened in heavy silence. He knew the size of the bomb I held in my hands and hesitated to support me. "Ethan, this won't end just with the company, it could end with you too," he said. But his concern only reinforced in me the idea that I had something powerful. I wasn't just fired, I was armed. As the hours passed, I scribbled scenarios on loose sheets, tracing possible moves. I could sell the patents to a competitor or simply revoke them and let the empire bleed. Each option had consequences, but all led to Richard. No matter the path, the destination was always the same: make him feel the weight of what he had done. Revenge stopped just being desire and became calculation. In the sleepless early hours, the city's noise seemed distant, as if the world continued without noticing the approaching storm. I knew that soon there would be no way to hide the impact of what was coming. Each revocation would be a precise blow, a reminder that hubris has a price. And even though I was alone, my mind sharpened with every moment. The silence transformed into strategy. That night, when I closed my eyes, I realized that defeat hadn't beaten me. On the contrary, it had molded me for something greater. What Richard thought was the end of my story was just the prologue of an invisible war. I didn't want just revenge, I wanted justice in the form of corporate ruin. And for the first time, I felt I was exactly where I should be, on the threshold of a planned earthquake. I discovered that legally, I still held rights over several patents that supported the flagship product. I spent days immersed in contracts and clauses, reading terms like war maps. The raw realization was almost liberating. I had levers that could move financial mountains. I didn't seek immediate recklessness. I wanted surgical precision so the blow would hit the error and not innocence. When I decided to act, I felt a strange calm, like pressing a button, knowing the reach of the pulse. I planned the order of revocations to maximize technological and legal impact at the same time. There were dependencies between patents that, if removed in the right sequence, would create a domino effect. I charted timelines, assessed legal windows, and considered market repercussions to avoid unnecessary human collapses. Each step came with cold calculations and the awareness that it would also change me inside. Even so, I could no longer retreat. The spark had ignited a fire I needed to see consumed. When I executed the first revocation, the effect was more immediate than I had imagined. Internal reports oscillated, suppliers called worried, and rumors began to leak. I saw the first online headline and felt a shiver mixing triumph and fear. The sound of that victory was dry, almost mechanical, like the click of a relay triggered in the dark. From then on, every move would require more care, because the enemy now knew how to react. I received anonymous messages and cold calls from unidentified corporate numbers. There was the predictable movement of lawyers, but also signs of panic in sectors dependent on my inventions. I didn't celebrate disasters. I observed metrics, flows, and failure points to calibrate the next sequence. Michael warned about reputational risks and voices that could turn my action into public villainy. My response was simple. If the choice was to be remembered as avenger or pivot of ruin, I preferred justice. I began building a controlled narrative for when the world reacted forcefully. I contacted safe sources and noted facts that could contextualize my actions as response, not blind revenge. I didn't want to be just the man who destroyed. I wanted to be the man who exposed the rot that justified the measure. As I organized evidence, I felt the engineer revive, the one always driven by systems and technical truth. The difference now is that I used knowledge as an instrument of correction, not just invention. In the early morning after the third revocation, I faced my reflection and didn't like the gleam I saw in my eyes. There was determination, but also something like a scar that was slowly becoming identity. I asked myself if there were alternatives I had overlooked out of pride. The answer came empty. The alternatives had been burned by those who believed they could publicly humiliate me. And so, knowing the price would be high, I confirmed I would follow the plan to the end. The market reacted as predicted, but with a violence that showed how critical that company was in the ecosystem. Competitors breathed deeply, suppliers began renegotiating contracts, and shareholders sought immediate explanations. I watched the charts from afar, attentive to peaks and valleys, knowing each of my moves altered lives. I didn't delude myself. I understood that my revenge created waves that would affect beyond the direct target. Even so, it was necessary to expose the fragility built on arrogance and impunity. Social media quickly turned the case into a public debate topic with polarized opinions. I was called traitor, hero, madman, and avenger in a few hours, with no middle ground. Sophia, the journalist who would come to know better, sent the first message with surgical questions and a curious tone. There were those who just wanted scandal, and those who sought to understand the origin of the earthquake. I needed to decide whether to open the toolbox of the past or keep everything contained. Meanwhile, the company intensified legal actions and attempts at temporary revocation blocks. High-caliber lawyers knocked on the door of my old building with petitions and veiled threats. Michael worked tirelessly, responding and preparing defenses that would eventually be needed. I felt the pressure increase, but each challenge gave me new fragments of their modus operandi. The legal war was beginning to draw the field where the final battle would take place. There were also more subtle attempts. An executive even offered a financial settlement to silence the disclosure. I refused because it wasn't about commercial extortion. It was about correcting systemic injustice. I knew accepting a check would solve my personal problems momentarily, but kill the greater cause. The refusal intensified hostilities, and the tone of communications became less diplomatic. I realized I was in check, but also in a position to demand transparency and consequences. Amid the whirlwind, the loyalty of former colleagues was tested. Some approached to support, others distanced themselves. I received discreet calls from people confessing that they had been victims of similar practices within the company. These reports served to strengthen my conviction that there was something bigger to expose. I began compiling testimonies and documents that, together, would form a mosaic of questionable practices. With each story gathered, my actions stopped being personal to become a portrait of a rotten system. At the end of that initial cycle of blows, I realized I had achieved something greater than temporary economic damage. I had lit lights in corners where people normally avoided looking. The fight had become less about Richard and more about institutional accountability. I, who had always sought to build, now saw myself as a catalyst for change, albeit heavy and painful. And with that awareness, I prepared the next stage. Amplify the exposure and ensure procedural justice followed the damage. The first official summonses arrived like swarms, page after page of sharp legal language. The company's lawyers wanted to paralyze my actions, alleging abuse and breach of contract. I read each line and realized they weren't seeking justice, but time to contain the chaos. Michael explained defense strategies, but also warned about risks of psychological wear. The siege wasn't just legal, it was psychological and economic, designed to force me to retreat. I received cold letters with threats of personal liability for billion-dollar damages. There were even insinuations about freezing my assets and possible criminal sanctions. All that was theater, but theater with real consequences if I lacked discipline. I didn't let it shake me. On the contrary, I realized that the more aggressive they became, the more fragile their position was. They weren't used to someone with the courage to flip the table. Richard also moved in the shadows, activating political contacts and influencing media outlets. I began to be portrayed as a resentful employee seeking personal revenge for wounded pride. Some newspapers called me a saboteur, others a threat to market stability.
But I knew each line of attack reinforced the David versus Goliath narrative, and the more they tried to paint me as the villain, the more curiosity arose around my side of the story. The pressure increased when I received calls from former colleagues being intimidated to testify against me. It was painful to see people I respected trapped by fear of unemployment and corporate blackmail. Some distanced themselves in silence, others confessed discreet support, but without the courage to expose themselves. I understood I was alone in that trench, and that was exactly what Richard wanted, to turn my fight into an isolated case and not a symptom of something larger. In those hours, my mind sought clarity in patterns, as it did when designing complex machines. If I was the smaller piece trying to resist the gear's crushing, I needed to act as the pivot. Strength wouldn't come from facing each tooth of the wheel, but from dismantling the central axle. And that axle wasn't the company itself, but Richard's inflated ego, sustained by uncontested power. My strategy became not just revoking patents, but exposing hidden truths. I closed the week with the conviction that the siege wouldn't topple me, just mold me. Each attack was a confirmation that I was hitting the target and causing real discomfort. It was inevitable that the war would intensify, but also inevitable that each of their actions revealed fissures. And deep down, I realized something almost poetic. They were more afraid of me than I of them. That perception gave me the courage needed to plan the next move. It was in this scenario that I met Sofia Ramirez, an investigative journalist who wasn't satisfied with official versions. She sent me a short, direct message, no beating around the bush, asking me to tell my side of the story. At first, I hesitated to respond, fearing it was just another piece of manipulation. But there was something in her objective and incisive tone that awakened trust in me. I felt that perhaps I had found an unexpected ally in the midst of the war.
In our first meetings, I realized Sofia didn't want just flashy headlines. She sought to understand the logic behind every decision I had made. She asked questions that cut deep, forcing me to revisit memories of years of dedication. As I spoke, she noted calmly, but with eyes that seemed to record every detail. It was strange to feel that someone was finally listening to my truth without immediate judgments. Over time, we began sharing information that went beyond my case. She revealed me complaints from other employees, stories of exploitation and abusive contracts. It was as if my gesture had released a dammed river of silenced voices. Each testimony confirmed that my fight wasn't individual, but collective. And Sofia began weaving a narrative that could dismantle the company's facade. Richard, in turn, noticed the media movement and tried to delegitimize it. He accused Sofia of sensationalism, of inventing sources, of working for competitors. But the more he attacked, the more credibility she gained, because her reports were consistent. I knew she was taking risks, and that made me question if I should involve her so much. But there was no turning back. We were connected by a story bigger than both of us. Our conversations sometimes crossed the professional boundary. I found myself revealing vulnerabilities, doubts, and even personal memories I had never told anyone. She listened attentively, but always returned to the central point. The fight needed to continue. Sofia had a silent conviction that reminded me of what I had lost. And perhaps, without realizing it, she began returning a part of my own strength to me. In that period, I realized my battle was no longer invisible. Sofia's words echoed in news portals and social media, demanding answers. I stopped being just a fired engineer and became a symbol of resistance. That transformation scared me, but also gave me renewed energy. And looking ahead, I understood the impact would be much greater than I had foreseen. With Sofia's help, I began diving into forgotten documents and muffled reports. We discovered that the company not only relied on my patents, but stole ideas from employees. There were camouflaged contracts, land-in clauses, and agreements that drained inventions without giving credit. Each analyzed paper revealed a pattern of exploitation far beyond my case. It was a culture of appropriation, disguised as meritocracy, fed by the power of the Stone surname. The reports were devastating, engineers who lost years of research without recognition, scientists silenced by abusive confidentiality clauses, prevented from complaining in court. Sophia showed me these stories, and I saw myself reflected in them as part of a dark mosaic. I wasn't the only wronged, just the only one who decided to react out loud, and that gave me even more certainty that the path I had taken was inevitable. As we cataloged evidence, I realized revenge was gaining new meaning. It wasn't just about destroying Richard, but exposing a system built on lies. I wasn't just a victim, but also a spokesperson for a greater cause. Each attached file, each recorded testimony made my action more legitimate, and the further we advanced, the harder it would be for them to hide the internal rot. The nights of research became long and exhausting, but also liberating. Sophia worked side by side with me, and our trust grew with every revelation. I admired her for the courage to expose herself against such a powerful empire. There were moments when we forgot the war and just talked like two survivors. But with every dawn, the fight returned as absolute priority. Richard, realizing the accusations could spread, tightened the siege even more. He hired PR firms to try to clean his image and discredit complaints. But what he didn't know was that the material we had was too solid, and with every attack he made, Sophia responded with an even more incisive report. The game was turning, and the enemy was beginning to lose control of the narrative. At that moment, I realized my revenge was no longer just mine. It belonged to all who had been forgotten, exploited, and discarded by the system. My voice was just one among many, but now amplified by a journalistic megaphone. I couldn't quit anymore, because quitting would betray those who depended on me. The war had become bigger than any initial calculation I had made. As I advanced, Michael began showing signs of tension. He was my lawyer, my friend, but he was also being pressured. The company had discovered vulnerable points in his personal and professional life, and they began using that as blackmail currency to make him give up. I saw in his eyes the weight of carrying a war that perhaps wasn't his. Michael called me for a talk in a discreet Brooklyn cafe. There, he confessed he was being followed, monitored, and even threatened. He said he might not hold up sustaining my defense against Richard's machine. I felt the pain of seeing my friend being swallowed by a battle I started. And for the first time, I questioned if I was taking everyone into the abyss with me. The trust we had began to crack in small, painful fissures. Michael hesitated to sign documents and reviewed clauses with fear of traps. I knew he wanted to protect me, but also wanted to save his own life. I couldn't blame him, but I also couldn't give up the cause. His loyalty was being tested in an unequal war. Meanwhile, Sophia remained steadfast, almost obstinate, in the investigative work. She noticed my doubts and always reminded me of the collective impact of the fight. "Ethan, it's not just you against Richard, it's you against an entire system," she would say. Those words echoed when I thought of retreating, bringing unexpected strength. It was strange to realize that her courage sustained mine. Richard, on the other hand, tried to exploit that fragility. Rumors began circulating that Michael might testify against me. It was hard to separate lie from truth amid so much manipulation, but each rumor was like a knife slowly plunged into my trust. I needed to decide who to believe and what risk to assume. In the end, I understood that betrayals were inevitable in an asymmetric war like this. Power corrupted, fear deformed, and few had the courage to resist to the end. I knew I would face more losses before victory, if it came, but I also knew there was no way back for me. I was trapped in that battle as much as I breathed the air that kept me alive. Richard intensified his offensive against me with a carefully rehearsed public campaign. In interviews, he called me a traitor, ungrateful, and even an enemy of innovation. Business magazines splashed my photo next to headlines painting me as a villain. Seeing my reputation, built over decades, dismantled in days, was painful, but at the same time, each attack only revealed the fear he felt of me. I saw former company colleagues reproducing the official discourse without question. Some seemed genuinely to believe I was a saboteur.
Others just followed the self-preservation script the system demanded. I felt anger, but also pity for those without the courage to look beyond the facade.
Clara, his daughter, became a central piece in this theater of power. The company released images of her taking meetings as a symbol of the new generation. But in the corridors, reports emerged of her incompetence and unchecked arrogance. I watched her from afar, not with hate, but with the coldness of someone awaiting the inevitable. She was, in many ways, the reflection of the vanity that fueled the entire empire. In parallel, Sophia published articles dismantling the official narrative. She showed documents, testimonies, and evidence contradicting Richard's versions. With every report, more people began questioning the company's legitimacy. The information war had become as intense as the legal one. And I began to realize I was no longer alone in that trench. Even so, there were days when the pressure nearly crushed me. I received threats, anonymous messages, and even discreet visits trying to intimidate me. My personal life reduced to paranoia and nighttime vigils. But amid the fear, there was also a flame that wouldn't go out. I had already lost so much, and I couldn't allow it to be in vain. Richard's mask wouldn't fall from a single blow, but from constant cracks. In every new lie he told was more weight on his own ruin. I just needed to resist long enough for the truth to surface. And I knew the final stage wouldn't be the press, but the courtroom. It was there that the masks would fall for good. The courtroom was a different battlefield, but equally brutal. There were no headlines or marketing campaigns, just evidence and arguments. Richard entered the room with his usual cold smile, sure of victory. I, on the other hand, carried the weight of every document, every collected testimony. I knew everything would be decided there, before judges and relentless lawyers. My first testimonies were long and exhausting, full of technical details. I explained how each patent had been registered and used by the company. I described contract manipulations and abuses suffered by other colleagues. The company's lawyers tried to interrupt, disqualify, and ridicule me. But every response of mine was backed by evidence they couldn't topple. Richard, in his defense, theatricized as always. He spoke of loyalty, future vision, and the supposed collective harm I was causing. He tried to paint me as selfish, a man unable to overcome personal grudges. There were moments when I noticed doubt in the jurors' eyes. The scales were still swinging, and I knew I could lose everything. Sophia followed every hearing from the front rows, with attentive eyes. Her presence was a reminder that there was something bigger at stake. She encouraged me with discreet nods, as if saying not to give up. I absorbed that silent energy and turned it into strength. Without her, I might have yielded to the suffocating pressure of those sessions. The most critical moment came when the lawyers presented false evidence. They tried to insinuate that I had manipulated records to profit from rivals. For an instant, I felt the ground open, and fear nearly made me lose control. If that lie were accepted, my cause would crumble in seconds, but something unexpected was about to happen. As I prepared for defense, I noticed Clara watching everything in silence. She seemed uncomfortable, different from the arrogant image she always projected. And in that look, I realized there might be a twist in sight. Something told me the daughter of my enemy could become the key. The courtroom still hadn't shown its biggest surprise. Clara stood up unexpectedly in the courtroom, breaking her father's rehearsed staging. Her steps echoed in the silent room, and all eyes turned to her. Her voice, firm but choked, revealed she could no longer sustain the farce. She confessed to having documents in hand proving irregularities in contracts. It was as if Richard's untouchable wall began to crumble before everyone. The judge authorized Clara to present the papers, and the impact was immediate. There was evidence of record manipulation, bidding frauds, and even veiled bribes. The company's lawyers tried to disqualify her, alleging family conflict, but the clarity of the documents spoke louder than any justification. I watched in silence, incredulous, seeing the daughter turn against the father. In that instant, Richard's image of arrogance broke for the first time. He tried to maintain control, but nervousness trembled in his voice. The jurors no longer looked at him with respect, but suspicion.
The mask he had cultivated for decades crumbled before the exposed truth. And I knew that was the turning point we had waited for.
Clara didn't declare herself my ally, but made it clear she could no longer collude. It was an ambiguous gesture, a mix of rebellion and late justice. I saw in her eyes that it wasn't about helping me, but freeing herself. And even so, the practical effect was devastating for the Stone Empire. In that courtroom, power changed hands irreversibly. Sophia recorded everything with her swift pen, ready to narrate it to the world. She knew this revelation would be an international headline. I, on the other hand, just felt a mix of relief and strangeness. My greatest enemy had become the decisive piece in my victory. And that, in a way, left me uncomfortable. When the courtroom adjourned the session, tension hung in the air. Richard avoided looking at his daughter, as if she were a ghost. I approached Clara and thanked her in a few words without feigning complicity. She just nodded with teary eyes and walked away in silence. I knew I would never see her the same way again. The following days were an earthquake for the company. Stocks plummeted, contracts were suspended, and partners distanced themselves. Richard was ousted from his position by pressure from the board itself. The one who seemed untouchable was now alone, surrounded by debts and accusations. The empire he had built on hubris began to crumble. Headlines spoke of an unprecedented corporate scandal. Sophia published daily revelations that deepened the crisis even further. Employees began manifesting publicly against years of abuses. The truth that was once silenced now echoed in all directions, and I realized it wasn't just my victory, but theirs. Richard tried to resist, appealing to speeches of persecution and injustice, but with every statement, his power shrank like ice in the sun. Society no longer believed his words, only his falls. The one who always controlled narratives was now prisoner of them, and I watched from afar, like a spectator of his ruin. Clara temporarily assumed some functions, but with a different posture. She spoke of reconstruction, transparency, and employee valuation. It was ironic to see the arrogant daughter now dressed as a reformer. I didn't know if it was sincere or just survival, but either way, the empire would never be the same. Amid all this collapse, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief for justice, but also emptiness for the destruction. I had always been a builder, not a demolisher, and that weighed on my heart. Victory had a metallic taste, cold and bitter. I wondered if it had really been worth it. Even so, the world moved on. I had achieved the impossible, toppling a giant. Richard was finished, the company shattered, and my revenge fulfilled. But the cost was too high to celebrate in peace. And I already sensed the story wasn't over. When the courtroom gave its final sentence, I felt the weight of the silence that filled the room. Richard was defeated, ousted from his position and prosecuted, while the company he used as an extension of his own ego crumbled in public square. I should have felt fully victorious, but the victory came with an emptiness I hadn't expected. I spent years building things, and in that moment, I realized my greatest creation had been the destruction of an empire. The sensation wasn't sweet, it was metallic, bitter, like cold iron in the mouth. The newspapers called me a hero, a symbol against corporate corruption, but I knew heroes don't sleep on mattresses of unease. I lost nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would have taken the same path had I known the real price. Because revenge didn't just destroy Richard, it destroyed a part of me that believed in creation, progress, and the purity of engineering. The 42-year-old man who left the company months ago no longer existed. In his place was someone molded by fire, silence, and resentment. This version of me carried victories and scars in equal measure. Sophia wrote the last report on the case, highlighting not just my fight, but the larger movement that formed.
The repercussion brought investigations into other companies, complaints that were once buried, and voices that finally gained courage. I knew I had provoked a wave that wouldn't stop anytime soon, and that awareness gave me some consolation. It wasn't just my personal war, it was a structural change that could protect others from living what I lived. Still, the taste of sacrifice didn't leave me, because along with Richard, part of my own world had been demolished. Clara temporarily assumed leadership of the company, promising to rebuild it on new foundations. I watched from afar, not knowing if that transformation was sincere or just a matter of survival. I felt no resentment seeing her speak, because in a way, she too had been a prisoner of a system shaped by her father. Perhaps fate had reserved for her an opportunity to do differently, and I wouldn't be the man to deny that. I just hoped the lessons wouldn't get lost in time, like so many other stories of power and fall. That late afternoon, as I walked the streets of Manhattan, I thought about everything I had lost and gained. Victory brought me respect and fear in equal measure. Doors closed and others opened, but none seemed truly mine. I still had my ideas, I could still invent, I could still create, but now I carried the awareness that creation and destruction can live in the same mind. Perhaps that was the true price of revenge. Never again looking at my own work with innocence. I had crossed an invisible line, and there was no return. It was then that I received a call from a group of mysterious investors interested in offering me a new beginning. They wanted me to lead an independent technology company far from the shadows of the Stone Empire. The proposal seemed tempting, but also an invitation to return to the same game I had sworn to abandon. I smiled as I hung up, because I realized the story didn't end there. Perhaps it was just the beginning of another battle, and I needed to decide if I still wanted to fight or finally rest.